This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace. You know when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself? Talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance? No problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Before I head to the episode, let me introduce you to A Little Wicked podcast, hosted by the wonderful Kayla and Lexi, who, like myself, have been on a break from their show, but are back to bring you conspiracy theories, mysteries, and true crime stories. My favourite episode focuses on conspiracy theories surrounding the Titanic, which is a personal passion of mine. Here is a taste of A Little Wicked.
Hi, I'm Kayla, and my co-host Lexi and I host a podcast called A Little Wicked. We discuss true crime cases along with cults, conspiracy theories, cryptids, and really anything that we find strange or interesting to share with you guys. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts.
Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13. Before I head to the episode, let me introduce you to A Little Wicked podcast, hosted by the wonderful Kayla and Lexi, who, like myself, have been on a break from their show, but are back to bring you conspiracy theories, mysteries, and true crime stories. My favourite episode focuses on conspiracy theories surrounding the Titanic, which is a personal passion of mine. Here is a taste of A Little Wicked.
Hi, I'm Kayla, and my co-host Lexi and I host a podcast called A Little Wicked. We discuss true crime cases along with cults, conspiracy theories, cryptids, and really anything that we find strange or interesting to share with you guys. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. In this episode, I explore the murder of 14-year-old Alan Livesey, who was killed in his own living room. But was the person sentenced for the crime really the perpetrator? The youngest of Margaret and Bob's 3 children, Alan Livesey was born on the 27th of October 1964. He had lived on the Crescent in Bamber Bridge with his family since he was 8 years old. While his 43-year-old mother, Margaret, was a care worker and his dad worked for the car manufacturer British Leyland, it was his 19-year-old brother Derek whom Alan looked up to. At the time of his murder, Derek was serving in the army, and Alan wished to follow in his footsteps and so joined the army cadets. His older sister Janet had recently moved out of the home and was busy planning her wedding with the assistance of her mother. In general, they were the picture of a stereotypical family, living in an area where the neighbours knew each other, looked out for one another, and as was the case with many close-knit communities, gossip was rife. 43-year-old Margaret was a typical mother who juggled working full-time as a care assistant with the role of being a housewife and parent. She ensured tea was on the table, clothes were cleaned, and the home was tidy. and although raising a teenage boy wasn't always easy, she loved her children dearly. Her days spent worrying about Derek serving overseas, fussing over the details of Janet's impending wedding, and fretting about keeping 14-year-old Alan on the right path. For Margaret, the 22nd of February 1979 was just another ordinary day. Waking up, rushing round to ensure Alan had his breakfast and left for school on time, while also getting ready and dressed for work herself. Having waved Alan off to school, Margaret left to start her shift at a local nursing home, where she helped care for elderly patients. Once her workday had done, the 43-year-old returned home to start her household chores. While waiting for the washing machine load to finish, she put some pork chops under the grill, then sat in the living room and peeled some potatoes to accompany the meal. Margaret proceeded to empty the washing machine and hung the wet items on a clothes horse in front of the gas fire in the living room to dry. Upon his return home from school, Alan would join his mum and dad at the table for tea. Once the meal was consumed, they would bid goodbye to Bob as he headed off to work the night shift at the British Leyland car factory. Forgetting about the peeling knife she had left on the sofa, Margaret proceeded to wash up the dishes from their meal, and at around 6 p.m, she and Alan made their nightly walk to the local off-licence, from where the mother of three usually purchased a couple of cans of cider, while Alan was bought some sweets and a pack of 20 Dunhill cigarettes. But tonight would be different. The 14-year-old would miss out on his treats, as he was being punished for stealing a car and taking it for a joyride. Another part of his punishment was that he was banned from leaving the house except for going to school and attending army cadets, and he was not allowed to have friends over when his mother was not at home. The last one would be put to the test when at 8:30 that evening Margaret headed off to meet up with some friends at a nearby pub, leaving Alan alone watching television. At the Queen's Hotel public house, Margaret was able to unwind with her friends Frank Bamber and Marion Walker, with whom she enjoyed 4 half-pints of cider. Leaving the venue, the two women briefly chatted as Frank cleared the frost from his windscreen, with Marion and Margaret bidding each other goodbye, with the latter joining Frank in his car. Pulling up at the end of Colin Road North, Margaret exited the vehicle, waved goodbye to Frank and proceeded to head towards her home. As she did so, her attention was drawn to 2 shadowy figures loitering beneath the window of a friend's house. Getting nearer, she recognised them as 2 neighbourhood boys, Tony Rogers and Andrew Matthews. The latter lived at the home they were lingering by. Margaret knew the 2 teenagers were not supposed to be together and called out to them, which caused the youths to run away. She then went to knock on her friend, Mrs. Matthews' front door, to advise the occupant that her son, Andrew, had been with a child he was banned from being around. Invited into the house, Margaret was greeted by Mrs. Rogers, who was also visiting the home and was the mother of Tony Rogers. While the 3 neighbours sat down and had a drink of cider, Mrs. Matthews instructed her 18-year-old son, Leslie, to go and find his younger brother, Andrew. Leslie returned swiftly and told his mother that he couldn't locate his sibling, to which Margaret suggested he try her home, as Alan was friends with the boy, and although he wasn't supposed to have friends over, he may have disobeyed her. So Leslie set off once more to find his brother, this time heading down the street to the Livesey home, where he knocked on the front door but received no answer. Able to hear the television, Leslie thought maybe Alan hadn't heard him knock, so the 18-year-old headed to the living room window at the front of the house. The curtains were drawn, but through a small gap he could see the light and the television were on, but there were no signs of any movement, even after he had knocked on the window pane. Failing to get a response, Leslie headed back to his own house to report that Alan hadn't answered, adding that the front door of the Livesey home was locked, which was odd, as they rarely bolted the door. Margaret theorised that Alan had probably fallen asleep, so handed Leslie her house key and asked him just to check that her son was okay. While Leslie was gone, Margaret continued her conversation with her friends. Yet within a matter of minutes the 18-year-old returned. He was out of breath, his face ashen and his eyes wide with shock. The shaking boy managed to perch himself on a chair in the corner of the room, before informing those present that Alan was dead. Margaret's average day was suddenly turned upside down, as she hastily returned with Leslie to her home. The burly 18-year-old tried to dissuade her from entering, but nothing could have prevented the concerned mother from reaching her son. Swiftly she pushed past Leslie and entered the living room, to find her son lying on his back on the floor, the carpet beneath him wet with blood. She knelt beside Alan, taking his head and placing it on her lap. She looked upon his lifeless face, his eyes staring straight back at her, unmoving, unblinking. This vacant stare was unbearable, and as she cradled her dead child she attempted to seal his eyelids with her hand, but found it impossible. The next few days were a whirl of activity for the 43-year-old mother as a full-scale murder investigation was launched. The house had turned into an active crime scene. Officers were deployed to obtain witness statements, while others searched gardens, drains and wasteland for anything that may have been discarded by the killer. In the meantime, Margaret existed in a grief-stricken daze, unable to sleep and given medication to calm her. She couldn't shake off the feeling of guilt for leaving her 14-year-old son alone, and regretted that their final interactions had been tainted with anger and disappointment due to Alan's recent behaviour. It was under this cloud of grief, guilt and regret that Margaret was routinely questioned regarding her recollections of the day's events. She provided police with a statement of her movements on the 22nd of February 1979, a day that had changed her life forever. Just 5 days after the murder, the police announced a major breakthrough in the case. An individual had been arrested and charged with the murder of 14-year-old Alan, thanks to witness testimony and a confession from the perpetrator. Police had conducted interviews with everyone that knew the Livesey family, especially Alan. This included his school friends and his fellow army cadets, but focus soon turned to his home life, particularly when the two neighbours who lived on either side of the family came forward with reports of what they had seen and heard, not only on the night of the murder, but in the months prior to that fateful day. These two neighbours reported that they had often heard Margaret shouting at Alan, and that she had treated him badly, to the extent that the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the NSPCC, had sent an agent out to investigate claims of neglect and abuse. Another person who had often seen the mother and son was a lady who ran the off-licence, which Alan and Margaret visited daily. She told police that when the pair had come into the store on the evening of the murder, she noticed that there was a lot of tension between them, and that Margaret had refused to purchase Alan his usual sweets and cigarettes. Alongside allegations of a fraught relationship between Margaret and Alan, the neighbours would also tell police about what they had witnessed on the night of the murder, advising that they had heard a heated argument at about 11 p.m. This was roughly 15 minutes before 18-year-old Leslie found Alan's body, with the police being notified of the crime from a public telephone box at 28 minutes past 11. When the pathologist examined Alan's body, he estimated the teenager had died at around 11 o'clock that night, which was consistent with the timings provided by the neighbours. The pathologist also concluded that the 14-year-old's cause of death was due to the 10 stab wounds that had been inflicted to the boy's neck and chest, which had led to him bleeding out. Piecing the timeline together, police believed that Alan had been killed at around 11 p.m, and due to the witness testimony, they now had a prime suspect, Margaret Livesey, who, having been accused of mistreating her son, was brought into the station for further questioning. During her police interview, the 43-year-old insisted she couldn't recall what had occurred that night, but investigators had a suspicion of what had led to Alan being murdered. They believed that Margaret Livesey had returned home from the pub, and instead of heading to the Matthews house, she had gone straight to her own home. Upon her arrival, she had found Alan in the living room, wearing his Army Cadet uniform, which he had been forbidden from wearing except when he was attending meetings. Infuriated that Alan had disobeyed her, Margaret flew into a rage, and in the heat of the moment, she had grabbed the peeling knife she had left on the sofa and stabbed the 14-year-old. Realizing that she had killed him, Margaret then attempted to cover her tracks. She washed the knife, then proceeded to roll Alan onto his front and tied his hands behind his back. She then swiftly left the home, locked the door and headed to Mrs. Matthews' house, where she calmly shared a drink with her friends, while sending an unsuspecting Leslie to discover her son's body, thus creating an alibi for herself. It was a simple case of an abusive alcoholic mother losing her temper with fatal consequences. As she was interrogated by Detective Mariner and Detective Biscombe, Margaret was asked about her relationship with Alan and what type of arguments they usually had, to which she stated he was always wanting something. It was want, and he wouldn't do as he was told. Hinting at her fears that Alan was partaking in criminal conduct, she claimed she had suspected him of shoplifting. After, quote, "Last week I found a watch in the lining of his coat. Then I found some brand new batteries." Margaret also confirmed officers' suspicions that she would have been annoyed at Alan for wearing his cadet's uniform, confirming he was only supposed to wear it when he was going to meetings. Detective Mariner changed the course of the questioning by putting to Margaret what he believed took place that night. Quote, "I'll tell you what I think happened. You were dropped off in Collins Road North after leaving the pub. You got out of the car and walked straight to your house. So from leaving the pub you would get home about 11 o'clock. Margaret remained vague in her answers, stating, "Well, if you say that I've done it, then I must have, but I can't remember." The second officer in the room, Detective Biscombe, told her, "You will remember. You were just trying to shut it out of your mind. Just try and relax and it will come back to you." This did little to encourage her to speak, as Margaret started to fret about what her family would think and began to panic that she wouldn't be going home. Detective Mariner tried to calm her, asking her to slowly go through what happened. He reminded her that on the night of the murder, she had been dropped off after the pub and headed straight home. He then asked her if she had entered the home through the back or front door. Margaret replied, "The back, I think, because I went to the outside toilet." Detective Mariner then asked her to recall what she did when she entered the house, starting with whether she took her coat off, and if so, where did she place it? Pausing for a moment to gather her thoughts, Margaret answered by claiming she put it on the back of the sofa in the living room. When asked what happened next, she once again became distressed and began repeatedly saying, "I cannot remember." Mariner attempted to get her back on track. He reminded her that she had arrived home, entered through the back door, placed her coat on the back of the sofa in the living room, then prompted her into saying what she had seen, that Alan was standing there in his uniform. Margaret corrected him by saying, "Alan was lying on the floor." Mentioning that the 43-year-old had stated to police earlier that she had argued with her son, Margaret was asked to explain what had started the argument with Alan that night, to which she confessed, quote, "As soon as I saw him in his uniform, I thought he'd been out, but he kept denying it." Detective Biscombe inquired, "What did you do then?" Margaret responded abruptly, "Well, you know what I did then. I stabbed him and stabbed him." Wanting to pinpoint the murder weapon, Detective Biscombe asked, "What did you stab him with? Was it that ornamental knife or letter opener on the fireplace?" Margaret told them it was a kitchen knife, advising, quote, "It was on the settee. I must have left it there after peeling spuds. I usually peel the spuds in the front room." Detective Biscombe asked her what happened after you started stabbing him, to which she responded, "He fell to the floor. I stabbed him again, then I turned him over. I didn't want to look at him. It was the blood. I covered his neck with a sock." She was then asked to explain her actions after the murder, particularly why she bound her son's hands. Attempting to give a reason, she told them, "I suppose I was hoping they'd think somebody had broken in. I don't know." She then broke down lamenting, "Forgive me, Alan, I didn't mean to do it, son." The murder weapon was recovered from the family home, and despite forensic testing, was found to be absent of any blood, suggesting Margaret had thoroughly cleaned it. This, combined with the witness statements and Margaret's confession, would prove compelling evidence, with the case going to trial at Preston Crown Court on the 2nd of July 1979. The jury heard the details of what happened on the night of the murder and how Alan had been killed. They also heard the testimony from the prosecution's key witnesses, Christine Norris and Susan Warren, the neighbours who lived either side of the Livesey home. But the most damning piece of evidence would be Margaret's own words. Although by the time of her court appearance she had retracted her admission of guilt and now took to the stand to protest her innocence. 2 weeks after the trial commenced, the jury was sent out to deliberate. However, after 48 hours a problem arose, when one of the jurors had to leave due to a medical emergency involving a family member, resulting in the trial being disbanded. 8 days later, in the same courtroom with a different jury, a new trial commenced, and this time, after just 5 hours of deliberation, the 12 jurors returned to declare that they had found Margaret Livesey guilty of murdering her son. Normally, that would be where I would end the episode, with the perpetrator being caught and brought to justice. But had Margaret really arrived home from the pub at 11 p.m, flown into a rage, grabbed the knife she had left on the sofa, with which she proceeded to stab her son in a frenzied attack, after which she stayed at the crime scene, cleaned up sufficiently so there were no trace of blood on the knife, nor on her clothing or body, then headed to the Matthews home, and caused an 18-year-old boy to discover the murder to strengthen her own alibi. All this, according to the prosecution, Margaret would accomplish in just 12 minutes. There were some who questioned whether she was actually guilty, and began to dig into the details of the case, uncovering inconsistencies which only raised more concerns that an innocent woman was behind bars for a crime she may not have committed. Margaret's case would come to the attention of the BBC programme Rough Justice, which was described by its creator Peter Hill as a, quote, groundbreaking BBC TV series in the early 80s. It produced evidence that innocent people were being imprisoned. It helped pressure the government into forming the Criminal Case Review Commission. After examining Alan's case, the people involved in the BBC series believe that Margaret may have been a victim of a miscarriage of justice, and what follows is based on what they discovered during their investigation, and how they came to the conclusion that Margaret Livesey may be innocent. So let's start with the events leading up to the murder. Alan had enjoyed a large meal at roughly 6:30. This would prove significant later when his time of death was being determined. He and his mother set off at 8:30 to go to the off-licence, where they were served by Dorothy Seed. She had told police that there was tension between the pair, which is possible given Margaret had recently learned that Alan had been caught in a stolen car by police, and she also suspected that he had been shoplifting. Dorothy would confirm that Alan was wearing jeans and a t-shirt when he came into the shop, adding support to the idea that he had changed into his Army Cadet uniform later that night. Upon returning home, Margaret had already been resolved to remain there, instead of going to meet her friends as she had originally planned, before her son had been grounded. However, during her trial, the 43-year-old claimed that after she and Alan had had a heart-to-heart, during which she had cried and told the 14-year-old she didn't trust him, the teenager had reassured her that he would change, and encouraged his mother to go out as planned, as a way of proving he could obey her. Perhaps wanting to give Alan a chance to prove himself, Margaret headed off to the now demolished Queen's Hotel on Church Road, which was approximately a 30-minute walk from her home. The public house, which was constructed in the 1930s, was once located on a main thoroughfare until changing road layouts rendered it a cul-de-sac. According to the Lancashire Telegraph, its heyday, when the A6 was the main road, people would stop off here on their way to the Blackpool illuminations. The passing trade died off with the changes in traffic. But on that night, the day trippers and holidaymakers would have been scarce. The illuminations no longer lit, and not many people opt to go to the seaside in the midst of winter, with the 22nd of February 1979 becoming increasingly cold. Yet there were a few loyal locals who endeavoured to venture out, including Margaret and her friends Frank Bamber and Marion Walker. The trio remained at the pub until roughly 10:45 p.m, although this would be the first of many timings that could not be sufficiently verified. Diana Jones, the manageress of the Queen's Hotel, acknowledged that Margaret had been in the venue that night and that the building was emptied of patrons at 11:15. Having exited the building, the trio lingered in the car park, Frank defrosting his car, while Margaret and Marion talked, with the latter stating that she believed they left the pub at 10 to 11, with Frank recalling Marion stating this time after looking at the clock in the bar. Rough Justice, however, speculated that public houses had a tendency of having clocks that were 5 minutes fast, suggesting that 10:45 was likely accurate. If they did leave at this time, Frank had to de-ice his windscreen, which may have taken at least 5 minutes, meaning that he and Margaret likely left the car park at around 10 to 11, and they proceeded to drive the 4-minute journey to the top of Colleen Road North, which led onto the Crescent, where Margaret's home was located. Frank would tell police that Margaret did not exit the vehicle straight away, with him claiming that the 43-year-old got out of the car after she had finished a cigarette, a claim Margaret would say she didn't remember. However, Bamber was certain that she got out of the car at 11 p.m, as he arrived home at 11:05, which is consistent as he lived a 5-minute drive away. It is what Margaret did after leaving the car which is of the most significance, as depending on the version, she is either an innocent mother accused of murdering her child, or she committed the crime and took calculating steps to cover her actions. The prosecution would argue that Margaret got out of Frank's car and headed down Collins Road North, in the direction of her home at 41 The Crescent. For context, Collins Road North is approximately 437 feet in length, lined on the right-hand side by 3 blocks of terraced houses and 2 semi-detached homes. Once one reaches the end of this street, the road bends to the left, and on this curvature, with its frontage facing the length of the road, is the home of Ellen Matthews. It is at this bend in the road that Collins Road North becomes the Crescent, which is shaped like a horseshoe that curves around a central square until it leads back to the upper part of Collins Road North. The Livesey's house is in the bottom left-hand corner of the Crescent, whereas the Matthews home is at the bottom corner where Collins Road North meets the Crescent. These details will prove crucial when considering what occurred that night. The prosecution claimed that instead of stopping at the Matthews home, as she claimed, Margaret had instead continued round the bend and traversed the bottom half of the Crescent to reach her home at roughly 3 minutes past 11. It was then alleged that over the next 12 minutes, Margaret argued with her son, stabbed him multiple times, then staged the scene, cleaned up and headed off to the Matthews house, which was roughly a minute's walk away. The prosecution would speculate that Margaret opted to take the long way round to the Matthews home, following the Crescent to the top where it rejoined Collins Road North, onto which she turned left and walked towards the Matthews home, making it appear as though she had just been dropped off and had not yet been to her property. However, this route would have taken 4 minutes to complete, narrowing the window of time for committing the murder to just 8 minutes. One of the main issues with all the witness statements would be the times that were provided. For instance, Mrs. Matthews would initially tell the police that Margaret had knocked on her door at 11 p.m, which contradicts Frank Bamber's claim that she had gotten out of his car at that time. Frank would later state that he arrived at his home at 11:05. One could conclude that Margaret left his vehicle at 11 p.m, meaning she would have arrived at Mrs. Matthews' home a couple of minutes later. In a subsequent statement, Mrs. Matthews would amend the time of Margaret's visit from 11 o'clock to 11:15, and although she reverted back to the original timings at trial, the prosecution would use her testimony that Margaret arrived 15 minutes later than first stated, which better fitted their timeline. Another resident from the Crescent, John Kershaw, would inform the police that he had seen Margaret walking towards Mrs. Matthews' home at 11:01 p.m. However, his evidence would not be used in court, with it being revealed later via the Rough Justice investigation. The BBC's Rough Justice series would also look at other people's whereabouts that night, to see whether there were similarities or differences in relation to Margaret's timeline. Given that the reason for her calling at the Matthews house was due to the two teenagers, Tommy Rogers and Andrew Matthews, being seen together, Rough Justice took a closer look at what the boys had been doing that night. They were able to place the pair in Bamber Bridge that evening, where they had been to a disco, despite their mothers forbidding them from attending. Using the clock at the employment office in the town centre, the boys were able to state that they had headed to Andrew's home at 5 to 11. At their slowest pace, it was estimated by the Rough Justice team that the boys would have taken 8 minutes to make that journey. Upon arriving at the Matthews home, they hid under the living room window, waiting for the moment at which Andrew could sneak into the house unseen, but they would be caught by Margaret Livesey. The two boys would recall that they had only just arrived at the property, placing their arrival at around 3 minutes past 11. Once again, this was consistent with Mrs. Matthews' original time of roughly 11 o'clock for Margaret's arrival, and supported the suggestion that Margaret had not gone to her home first. Leslie Matthews, who discovered Alan's body, would also help place Margaret at his family home, with him recalling that he too had been to Bamber Bridge that night and had arrived home at 10 past 11 to find Margaret was already there. While all these statements placed Margaret as arriving at the Matthews home prior to 10 past 11, another person, Tony Rogers, who is Tommy's older brother, was in the home, and he would claim that she had arrived at 15, and that Leslie Matthews had returned from Bamber Bridge at 11:30. However, this statement is questionable, due to the fact that it was Leslie who called the police to report the murder at 11:28, and so he would have been in the phone box at 11:30. Under the instruction of his mother, Leslie, having had a brief chat with Margaret, would head out in search of Tommy and Andrew. Having walked the street and seen no sign, he returned to his mother's home, and this time, accompanied by Tony Rogers, the two boys went in search of their siblings, with the advice from Margaret for them to check at her home for the pair. Tony and Leslie would make the 56-second journey to the Livesey home, yet having got no response from knocking at the front and back doors and the living room window, the pair returned to the Matthews home, after briefly stopping to chat to a friend before they arrived. Once they entered the house, another short conversation was had with Margaret, who handed Leslie a key to access her property. Little did the 18-year-old realise that he would encounter a scene which would haunt him forever, with some believing that Leslie had been placed in that position by Margaret, who wanted to distance herself from the murder. The first thing that Leslie noticed as he stepped over the threshold of the Livesey home was an overpowering smell of gas. Entering the living room, the television was on and the volume loud. Despite this, Leslie was soon distracted by the sight of Alan's body. He told the Rough Justice investigators that, quote, Alan lay on the carpet in front of the fireplace, with his hands tied behind his back and all that, and I thought, they're messing about. Someone is going to jump out and start messing about. So as I got down to him, I said, Alan, you all right? And no answer at all. So I shook him about, turned him over, he were all wet and that, and there was a red sock around his neck. So as I moved that away, I saw everything, cuts and bruises, cuts and gashes everywhere. With this, Leslie realised that the situation was serious, and his account continued by describing how he attempted to help Alan. I just tried giving him the kiss of life, and naught happened, and there were blood spurting out of his throat, so I covered it up with my hand, tried again, and nothing happened. After his efforts had failed, the 18-year-old raced back to his family home, where he broke the news to Margaret, and despite his pleas for her not to go inside the house, there was nothing that was going to prevent her from going to her son. Leslie watched as Alan's mother reached the motionless figure of her child, and muttered, I don't want him to die, with his eyes open, as she tried in vain to close Alan's eyelids. Leaving Margaret in the home, Leslie ran to the nearest phone box to raise the alarm, with his call being logged at 11:28 p.m. This is the only unquestionable timing in the whole case. The first officer would arrive just 3 minutes later, and although Margaret had turned off the gas, the home was still filled with the fumes, so the first thing the officers did was open all the windows in the already unheated home, allowing the freezing February air to engulf the house. While the cold air would prove to be a point of contention, the reason for why the gas taps had been on would be a question that remains unanswered. There is a number of possibilities, one pointing at Margaret's innocence, while the other supports claims she was the culprit. The first theory was that after killing Alan, Margaret had turned on the gas taps, perhaps hoping that the person who discovered the body was a smoker, and the spark from a cigarette or match would ignite the fumes, causing a fire and destroying incriminating evidence. Whether she intended this to be Leslie is uncertain, yet if she had purposely chosen him, her actions were both cruel and lacked thought. Not only was the 18-year-old subjected to a sight no one should have to see, but he was a non-smoker. There was no chance he would have started a fire. In her retracted confession, Margaret admitted to staging the scene to make it appear as though there had been a burglary, with the suggestion being that she had turned the taps on as part of this attempt. On the other side, the killer, knowing that Margaret smoked, turned the taps on, so that the unsuspecting mother would inadvertently cause the fire that destroyed the crime scene. Or was there another explanation that only Alan and his killer know? Perhaps the gas had been used in an attempt to subdue the 14-year-old, although surely the killer would have felt its effects too. The fire in the living room was unlit when the body was found, and the room was cold, so perhaps Alan had turned the taps on to start the heater when he was disturbed by his killer and thus unable to complete the task. Fortunately, despite the shock of seeing her son's body, Margaret had the wherewithal to turn off the gas whilst waiting for the police. The Rough Justice would later question what evidence had been missed. The series would point out signs that someone else may have been in the home that night, having picked up on a small clue in one of the crime scene photographs. There was a pack of cigarettes lying on the floor close to Alan's body. A seemingly insignificant discovery, given that Alan and his parents all smoked, yet it was the brand that the family did not use. So who did it belong to? Another potential clue that Alan had company was his choice of outfit. When Margaret left home that night, Alan had been wearing jeans and a t-shirt, as confirmed by Dorothy Seed, the shopkeeper. Yet during his mother's absence he had changed into his uniform. Much was made about Margaret being angry at Alan for wearing his cadet's uniform, with this apparently being the catalyst for her launching a rage-induced attack on the 14-year-old. But had he gotten changed at the request of his killer? Perhaps he was lured into wearing it, under the guise of some sort of army roleplay, which became a deadly game. This idea would support the fact that Alan's wrists were bound, and he did not seem to have put up any resistance. Although in her retracted confession, Margaret claimed she tied her son's hands after she had killed him to create the appearance of a robbery, the knots used in the bindings were not straightforward ones, with experts claiming that it would have required some skill and experience. The complexity of the knots suggested someone who had been trained, pointing to the idea that the individual may have been connected with the Army cadets. The pathologist in this case was presented with a number of issues before he had even begun to consider the approximate time at which the 14-year-old had died. For instance, when Margaret and Leslie had entered the home at around 11:25, they both noted that it was unheated, which meant that the body was already lying in a cold environment, which was made colder by the windows being opened to allow the gas fumes to escape. The windows would remain open, exposing the interior to the freezing exterior temperature, and given that the pathologist did not arrive at the scene until 20 to 3, it would have been impossible for him to determine what the initial room temperature was prior and just after death. Ultimately, the doctor would estimate that Alan had died roughly 3 hours earlier, placing the time of the murder at around 11 p.m. This fits with the prosecution's narrative that Margaret had killed her son. When performing the post-mortem, the pathologist discovered a total of 8 stab wounds, all having varying degrees of severity, with 6 of them deemed to be fatal, having penetrated up to 4 inches into some of the most vital parts of the body. 1 had entered the heart, another punctured the right lung, while another 2 entered the front of the boy's neck, which had resulted in the severing of the spinal cord. It was deduced that due to the manner in which Alan's clothing had been disturbed, alongside the locations and angles at which the wounds had been inflicted, Alan had likely been laying on his back with his attacker straddling his body, with the pathologist suggesting that a certain amount of force had to have been used to inflict the injuries. According to Margaret's statement, Alan had been lying on the floor when she attacked him, and given her claims that she was angry, the adrenaline produced from her rage-filled state may have given her the strength to cause the wounds. However, there were other aspects to the post-mortem that did not fit with the idea that it was a crime of passion, and suggested a more meticulous, even sadistic manner of death. It was discovered that aside from his fatal wounds, there were also another quartet of injuries that seemed more deliberate, described as being, quote, small nicks inflicted by the point of a knife. One of these 4 was a 1/4 inch cut across the upper eyelid of Alan's left eye, which would have needed to have been done with precision, as it was just deep enough to break the skin, as though the blade had been pressed gently against it. This was not consistent with a sudden and frenzied attack. Nor was the manner in which the red football socks had been used. Although they had been removed from Alan's neck by Leslie, it was evident that they had been around the neck during the attack, and not placed there afterwards. The reason for this conclusion was the discovery that the sock had been cut 11 times by the knife, and caught in the fibres were traces of human tissue. This may have explained the lack of blood found in the room. The pathologist had noted that Alan was likely lying down during the attack, which partially explains why there was no traces of blood found on the furniture or mantelpiece. It was suggested that the socks had also helped to prevent blood spray, leading to theories that the killer had purposely used them to avoid getting blood on themselves. Maybe this explains why no one noticed any spots on Margaret's clothing that night, although this is inconsistent with Margaret's statements, and it does seem inconsistent that a person in a fit of anger would have the forethought to pause to get some socks off a clothes dryer in order to prevent getting blood on themselves. There may have been another use for the socks. They may have been a gag to silence Alan, which had slipped from his mouth during the attack, meaning they were around his neck when these wounds were inflicted. According to Margaret's confession, the murder weapon had been the knife she had been peeling potatoes with earlier in the day, and had left it on the sofa arm in the living room. The police, pathologist, and prosecution seemed happy to accept this as the likely murder weapon, as it fit with the notion that the attack was carried out in anger and Margaret had grabbed the first weapon she could put her hands on. Yet the rough justice investigation would find that the particular knife, which the police believed Margaret had cleaned after the attack, had no traces of blood on it at all, even under the handle which was cracked and would have been very difficult to thoroughly clean. Most of the counter-arguments against how the forensic evidence had been deciphered had been provided to the rough justice team by pathologist Professor James Cameron, who had consulted on a number of high-profile investigations, including the Azaria Chamberlain case in Australia. Azaria was a 9-week-old baby who had been camping with her family in the outback in August 1980 when she disappeared from her tent. The suspicion would fall on the mother, Lindy, who alleged that dingoes had taken her child. Professor Cameron was sent photographs of the little girl's clothing, which he deduced had been cut with scissors, and that the heavy bloodstaining around the upper portion of the child's jumpsuit suggested that the baby had been decapitated. His evidence, alongside the discovery of what was believed to be blood splatter in the Chamberlain's car, led to the suggestion that Azaria had been murdered by Lindy on the front passenger seat of the vehicle. Under the weight of this evidence, Lindy Chamberlain was found guilty of murdering her daughter, despite her protests of innocence and numerous appeals. During her appeals, an investigation conducted by Network 10 and their 1984 documentary Azaria, A Question of Evidence, would uncover flaws in the case. They discovered that the supposed blood spots found in the family car and on a pair of scissors may have actually been caused by copper oxide dust found in the Chamberlain's hometown of Mount Isa, which when tested gave a false positive reading for fetal blood. With regards to the clothing, which Professor Cameron had only seen photographs of, a further physical examination would determine that the cuts, which he had believed were caused by scissors, were actually more consistent with canine teeth. However, none of this evidence helped to clear Lindy's name, and she would continue to serve her life sentence. It would be the disappearance of British tourist David Brett in 1986, close to where the Chamberlains had been camping, that would prove the catalyst to Lindy being exonerated. David had been walking up Uluru when he disappeared, prompting a thorough search of the area, during which his body was found, with it being determined that the 31-year-old had fallen to his death. Yet close to the scene, one of the search party saw a soiled and blood-stained baby's cardigan close to a dingo's den, and was shown to Lindy, who identified it as being the top her 9-week-old daughter had been wearing. This key piece of evidence caused the case to be reopened, resulting in Lindy being released from prison in 1986, yet she would not be fully exonerated until 2012. I mention this case as it was Professor Cameron's original evidence alongside a badly mishandled investigation which led to Lindy being convicted in the first place. He was also responsible for providing evidence in other cases which were later found to be unsound, proving that his conclusions were not always accurate. Yet at the time of the Rough Justice episode aired in October 1983, Professor Cameron was a director of the Department of Forensic Medicine at the London Hospital Medical College and was highly regarded in his field. He helped to influence how to detect and investigate whether a child had been a victim of abuse, and was an ardent supporter of the Sudden Infant Death Trust. Considering his knowledge regarding abused children, and given that Margaret had been accused of mistreating Alan, Professor Cameron's input into the Livesey case would hopefully help to determine whether the accusations had any merit. When he reviewed the evidence in the Livesey case, Professor Cameron did highlight some inconsistencies which could be credible in countering the argument that Margaret murdered her son. Having looked over the autopsy report and other evidence, Professor Cameron was the one who pointed out the lack of blood on the knife. However, it was his first impressions of the case that would suggest a different motive for the murder. Upon being shown the photos of the crime scene, the first thing the professor stated was that it was, quote, a homosexual bondage case. When asked by the Rough Justice team why he had come to this conclusion, the professor responded, I've seen many cases of mothers stabbing their kids. He proceeded to point out the injury to the eyelid, quote, but I've never seen any of them inflicting a wound like that one. He went on to suggest that the circumstances depicted in the crime scene photographs suggested that Alan had been a willing participant, with the implication that the killer was someone known to Alan and was likely an individual who he trusted or feared. Unaware of the danger he was in, the 14-year-old changed into his Army Cadet's uniform and allowed his killer to bind his legs and tie his arms behind his back. Once he had been restrained in such a manner, the teenager, though a strong and healthy individual, would have been unable to defend himself, which is consistent with the lack of defensive wounds on his body and the absence of any signs of a struggle having taken place. The smaller, superficial cuts to Alan's skin inferred that a form of torture had taken place, prior to the perpetrator inflicting the deeper, more severe wounds. Professor Cameron had provided the Rough Justice investigators with a new angle to work with. Had the murder been some sort of sadistic act, potentially carried out under the guise of role-playing? This new interpretation went against the idea that Margaret had acted out of rage. Professor Cameron re-examined the autopsy report made by Dr. Benstead, and contrary to the initial pathologist's findings, Cameron believed that based on temperature, rigor mortis, muscle stiffness and blood pooling, the likely time of death was roughly an hour earlier than the doctor's 11 p.m. estimation. The professor stated that his approximation of the time of death, being at around 10 p.m, was not only based on the factors I have already listed, but also the contents of the victim's stomach, which Professor Cameron conceded was not always an accurate indicator, but combined with the other evidence, and given that Alan had eaten a heavy meal of pork and vegetables around 6 p.m, with his food being undigested, the professor believed that death had occurred roughly 3 to 4 hours after Alan had eaten. If the murder had taken place at around 10 p.m, there was little chance Margaret had committed the crime, as she was witnessed at the public house at the time in question. This opens up the possibility that someone else was in the home that night and carried out the murder. As with any homicide investigation, eyewitness testimonies can prove to be both vital and flawed. and one of the main issues in the Margaret Livesey case was the inconsistencies in these statements, not only from Margaret herself, but from other key witnesses who, when initially questioned, provided one version of events, only to change it later. Aside from Leslie, who had discovered the body, there were 4 main witnesses, including Mrs. Matthews and Mrs. Rogers, the former being the occupant of the home Margaret visited that night. Mrs. Matthews was unable to provide an accurate time for Margaret's arrival at her home. Initially she claimed it was closer to 11 p.m, then changed it to approximately 11:15. The earlier time would have made it impossible for Margaret to have committed the murder, while the later time, which would be used by the prosecution, would have given her a sufficient window to carry out the crime. Mrs. Matthews and her other visitor to the home that night, Mrs. Rogers, both stated there was nothing untoward in Margaret's behaviour or her appearance, except for the fact she was wearing sandals despite it being February. This was due to an injury to her foot, which had been bandaged. Mrs. Rogers recalled that there were no stains on the bindings, which could suggest that either Margaret had changed the bandage after the murder, despite only having less than 12 minutes to commit the crime, stage the scene, and according to the prosecution, take the long way round to Mrs. Matthews' home. Or the bandage was clean because Mrs. Livesey had not killed her son. The other alternative is that the injury was caused during the attack and Margaret had bandaged it up afterwards. Another aspect that could have pointed to Margaret's innocence was the initial recollections of the Livesey's neighbours, Susan Warren, whose property shared a wall with them, and Christine Norris. Susan Warren lived to the left-hand side of the Liveseys and was at home that night with her boyfriend Ronnie Mason. When the pair had initially been questioned by the police, they both claimed to have heard raised voices from the other side of their party wall at roughly 10 p.m. Susan stated that this was the time she had taken her daughter to bed, while Ronnie recalled that he had been watching a film called The Streets of San Francisco, which finished just before the 10 o'clock news. Susan went on to tell the police that she assumed the noises were just Alan and some friends, recalling that the 14-year-old had often had visitors when his mother wasn't home. Ronnie added that after the disturbance at 10 p.m, there was no other sounds until they heard Mrs. Livesey's voice having found the body, and the arrival of the police a few minutes later. Meanwhile, Christine Norris, who lived at the opposite side of the Liveseys, with her property detached from theirs, was interviewed just after the murder and claimed she had not noticed anything untoward that night until the police arrived just after 11:30. While Christine had not seen or heard anything, another witness, Peter Nightingale, had potentially seen the killer leaving the back door of the Livesey home that evening. The rear gardens of the properties on the Crescent were bordered by low fences, beyond which was a small unlit footpath. Peter, who was the brother of Susan Warren, had been using the path to get to his sister's home that night. Yet as he went to climb over her fence, his attention was drawn to the sound of the neighbour's back door being opened. He found it odd that the kitchen light was switched off, yet in the din Peter was able to make out the figure of a man, roughly 5'10", with whitish blonde hair, and although he could not make out the individual's clothing, Peter believed that the person had been wearing an anorak based on the sound the fabric made when the man walked. More crucially, Peter stated that this encounter took place at roughly 10:10, which was consistent with Susan and Ronnie's testimony, as well as the conclusion by Professor Cameron that this was the estimated time of Alan's death. It also placed another individual in the Livesey home that night. Initially, the police, going off the timeline provided by these witnesses, believed that the person observed by Peter was a key line of inquiry, and efforts were made to identify this individual, with attention focusing on Alan's school and his association with the Army cadets. Yet 4 days after the murder, the direction of the inquiry changed, with a search for the unidentified man being halted and the scrutiny turning to Margaret Livesey. This was because Susan Warren and Christine Norris had both changed their accounts, and had also made accusations that Margaret had been abusive towards Alan. The two neighbours now claimed that they had often heard and seen Margaret's mistreatment of her son, with Christine alleging that she had seen the mother hitting Alan, and that the teenager had often been locked in his bedroom, from which he escaped from the upstairs window. The pair also recalled that the NSPCC had been contacted at one point, prompting the police to consider that with the majority of murders being committed by someone close to the victim, and the potential that this was an abusive relationship that had turned fatal, they had to take the allegations seriously. Detectives contacted the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, who acknowledged that a complaint against Margaret had been made, yet following an investigation, no evidence of neglect or abuse had been found. Despite this, detectives couldn't ignore reports that Alan and Margaret had often argued, with them beginning to suspect that the strained relationship between mother and son had led to murder. It wasn't only allegations of abuse that were made against Margaret by her neighbours. Both Christine Norris and Susan Warren changed their testimonies regarding what they had observed that night. The most significant change was in Christine's testimony. Initially, she had provided police with very little information, as she had claimed she had not heard or seen anything, and was only made aware of the murder when the police arrived at 11:30. Yet in her new statement, Christine went into detail regarding what had occurred that evening. She recalled that her boyfriend had left the house at 10 p.m, after which she had headed upstairs to bed, where she read a book till about 10:30. As she settled down to sleep, she heard raised voices from the Livesey home, identifying them as being Alan and Margaret, embellishing her story further by alleging that she had heard the 14-year-old cry out for help. Christine placed this as occurring at around 1 minute past 11, and that she had deduced this time from her radio alarm clock on her bedside table. This statement was compelling as it fit with the narrative that Margaret was the killer. However, unbeknownst to the police at the time, and only discovered later during the rough justice investigation, there was a potential flaw in Christine's timing. While the clock was located in the bedroom on a night, Christine would unplug it and plug it back in again downstairs during the day to use it as a radio. This action could have affected the accuracy of the clock, with it being possible that if it was just a few minutes fast or slow, it would not have been consistent with the accepted timeline of events put forward by the prosecution. But why had she and Susan suddenly changed their stories? When asked, Christina claimed that it was because she didn't wish to be involved in the investigation, yet reconsidered her position after speaking to her mother and, more crucially, Susan. It seems that after this conversation between the two neighbours, they had both realised that they had heard something that evening, with Susan also changing her statement. Initially, she had been alerted to noises from next door at around 10 o'clock, but she now believed it was just after 11:15. This doesn't align with the timeline for either the prosecution or the defence, as at this time, Margaret was at the pub. Whereas before she had stated she thought the raised voices were Alan's friends, Susan was now certain that they belonged to the teenager and his mother. Due to their testimonies on the 27th of February 1974, just 5 days after her son had been murdered, Margaret Livesey, who was grief-stricken, sleep-deprived, and taking various medications, was brought into the police station for questioning, this time as the prime suspect. When the interview commenced, the 43-year-old stuck to what she'd originally told the detectives regarding her movements that night, but as the questioning progressed, she seemed to stumble, become confused, and would ultimately confess to the crime, a decision she regretted a few days later and retracted, but the damage had already been done. Her own words were used against her. Were they the words of a killer, or a confession of a mother who, under great emotional and mental strain, had admitted to a crime she did not commit? When withdrawing her statement, Margaret claimed it was made while she was still in shock and had not slept in days. Could these factors have caused her to make a false confession? There have been many instances over the years where someone has admitted to a crime they have not committed, either through police coercion, reduced mental function, or sometimes people just do it for the attention. One could argue that Margaret Livesey had been acting under extreme mental strain. She was sleep-deprived. Despite being given sedatives to help her rest, she had been through a traumatic experience, and may have been suffering from a sense of guilt, not only because she had left Alan alone that night, albeit at his insistence, but this likely led to her belief that had she stayed with her son, the murder would not have occurred. Her guilt may have also stemmed from the fact that the pair had been going through a rough patch in their relationship. Margaret admitted that she had found Alan's behaviour hard to cope with, particularly with him being caught in a stolen car, and he had possibly been shoplifting. She was afraid he had fallen in with the wrong crowd, and was struggling to deal with the situation. The strained relationship would be the foundation on which the police would build their case against Margaret, utilising the reports of abuse and the claims that she had once admitted that Alan had been an unwanted pregnancy. Conclusions were drawn that the 43-year-old had resentment towards her son, which erupted into a violent and fatal rage. If one took her confession at face value, it seems a straightforward case, but there are some details that do not fit with the evidence. For instance, Margaret claimed that she placed one sock on Alan's neck after the murder. However, as discussed, it was a pair of socks, and they had been positioned on the neck during the attack. If the socks hadn't been there at the time of the stabbing, there would not have been any stab wounds or tissue caught in the fabric, and there would probably have been blood spray found on the walls, furniture, or on the killer's clothing. Yet Margaret had no signs of any stains when she arrived at Mrs. Matthews' home. Margaret also alleged that the binding of the hands had occurred after the attack. Firstly, the knots as stated were quite elaborate, and would have required a certain skill set to create them. Also, if Alan wasn't restrained during the attack, why was there no defensive wounds? Surely a healthy 14-year-old boy, who was larger and stronger than his mother, would have been able to at least put up a fight against her. Yet neither she nor her son showed signs that a violent tussle had occurred, and nothing in the room intimated that a struggle had taken place. The arguments for Margaret's guilt is that she committed the crime, effectively cleaned the scene, removed all traces of blood from herself, the murder weapon, and potentially the furniture and walls. She then made efforts to stage the scene to make it appear that a robbery had occurred, binding her son's hands, using a complicated knot, and turning on the gas, yet neglecting to make the room appear like it had been ransacked. She then locked the front door, which Margaret alleged was never done, in order to send someone else to her home under false pretences so they would discover the body. All of these events, from the initial argument, the murder, the clean-up, and her arrival at the Matthews home, could not have taken any more than 12 minutes, a small window of time when one considers how thorough the cover-up appeared to have been. Just a couple of days after Margaret had confessed, Peter Nightingale would be re-interviewed, after police had spoken to his brother Raymond, who had claimed that Peter had admitted lying to police about what he had seen. During this second interview, Peter would also change his story, now denying he had seen anything suspicious that night. When asked about this change in direction by a private detective working for Margaret's defence, Peter stated that he made the initial statement while being interviewed alone at the police station. He felt under pressure and fearful that he would be blamed for the murder. With all the scrutiny now firmly on Margaret Livesey, she would be brought to trial at Preston Crown Court. And as with Lindy Chamberlain, the 43-year-old faced trial by media. Throughout the trial, the press detailed the events in court, with headlines implying Margaret's guilt even before the verdict had been announced. This may not have been an issue if the jury, who were forbidden from reading or discussing anything involving the case, had reached a decision. Yet when they went to deliberate, one of the jurors had to leave due to a family emergency, forcing a mistrial. When the new trial date was set for 8 days later, it had a different jury. However, Rough Justice pointed out that the proceedings occurred in the same court as the first trial, and the jury members were drawn from people in the local area, who would have been exposed to the newspaper headlines that had been circulating in the previous weeks, meaning that they may already have had preconceived ideas regarding the case. At this second trial, the testimonies of Susan and Christine still featured prominently, yet unlike when they were first called to the stand, the pair seemed more prepared for the scrutiny they would receive regarding why they had changed their statements. Overall, they had a more polished presentation. But the judge would remind the jury to use their discretion when considering the veracity of their statements. Another witness who gave evidence was Peter Nightingale, who had reverted back to his original claim that he had seen someone leaving the Livesey home. Yet his credibility was called into question by a convincing prosecution, whose outline of the case, combined with the fact that Margaret had confessed, was enough to cause the jury to find Margaret guilty. Following the verdict, Margaret did not appeal her conviction, claiming she was advised not to by her legal team, and by the time she did decide to appeal, she was told that she had missed the cut-off date to do so. With Margaret behind bars, life on the present moved on. That was until the Rough Justice team decided to investigate the case. But the participation of the local residents would not be easily gained, with the crew being met with mistrust, hostility, and many individuals questioning why they were delving into a case where the perpetrator was clearly guilty. Primary witnesses in the case refused to speak to them, and it took 6 months just for the team to gain the trust of individuals who were either on the periphery of the case or were willing to act on behalf of these key witnesses. Gradually they were able to speak with Susan Warren and Christine Norris. Through their interviews with the latter, they learned about the radio alarm clock being relocated during the day. Meanwhile, they found Susan to be vague, seemingly unable to recall the details of that night. She told the team that she could not remember hearing anything at around 10 p.m, as she had originally claimed, but was certain that she had heard a disturbance at 11:15, with her stating it sounded like someone saying, "He's bloody dead." This was interpreted by the Rough Justice team as her having heard Leslie and Margaret finding Alan's body. Meanwhile, an interview with Peter Nightingale saw him revert back to the story he had originally given the police, and went on to tell at trial. He was certain he had seen a man leaving the Livesey home that night. The question as to why Susan, Christine and Peter had changed their testimonies has never been fully answered. Were they coerced during their police interviews? Did their knowledge of the fraught relationship between Margaret and Alan cause them to believe that she was guilty? Or had they lied to protect someone they knew? Peter originally claimed his first statement to police was made out of fear that he would be accused. So had his sister Susan attempted to cover for him? Without the input of the original witnesses, this is all just speculation. But there are two options in this case, based on which timeline one chooses to believe. Either that Margaret Livesey is guilty, or that going off the initial witness statements, there was someone else in the house with Alan at 10 p.m. That person had killed the teenager and was seen leaving the property by Peter. Who could this person have been? One suggestion was that Peter had witnessed Alan at the rear of the house that night, yet the pair knew each other, meaning Peter would have recognised the teenager. Given the details from the case, it is likely that the killer was someone known to Alan, and probably familiar with the Livesey's home, perhaps a school friend or an individual from the Army Cadets. I have seen suggestions that Margaret was a scapegoat for either her husband or her lover. Firstly, her husband Bob was at work that night, and Alan was seen in the hours after his father had gone to work, so it is unlikely that Bob would have returned to the house, committed the murder, then gone back to his job. It was revealed later that Margaret may have been having an affair, allegedly, with Frank Bamber, the man who had driven her home from the pub that night. As far as I'm aware, his relationship with Margaret was secret, and Frank was likely a stranger to Alan, so why would Frank have killed the teenager? Maybe the 14-year-old had discovered the affair and was killed before he could expose them. Following the airing of the Rough Justice episode titled The Case of the Tortured Teenager in October 1983, there was a renewed interest in the story, with the issue being raised in the Houses of Parliament the following month by Preston MP Stan Thorne, who raised the concerns that Margaret may be innocent. 7 years after her conviction, Margaret would petition against her sentence. Yet in December 1986, her appeal would be rejected, with the judge finding, quote, "We have carefully considered all these matters, and we are not of the view that this conviction was in any way unsafe or unsatisfactory. The more information that was adduced before us, the more we became convinced that the verdict to the jury was correct. This appeal is dismissed." Unable to clear her name, Margaret would be released from prison in 1989 on a lifetime parole. Unable to return to Bamber Bridge, she relocated to Surrey to be closer to her sister and began working as a caterer in a hospital. By November 2000, Margaret moved back up north to Walton-le-Dale. Now suffering from throat cancer, she would live out her final 3 months in sheltered housing, passing away in February 2001 at the age of 64. Even in her dying days, Margaret clung to her claims of innocence, even leaving a provision in her will for her solicitor to continue efforts to clear her name and maybe help bring her son's killer to justice. The last update I could find on the case comes from March 2016, when Lancashire Police announced they were reviewing the investigation. However, nothing regarding the outcome of this review has been disclosed, leaving the question of Margaret's guilt or innocence still unanswered. To me, the details of this case are ambiguous. There was nothing to directly implicate Margaret in the murder in terms of blood on her clothing, etc., and the changing testimonies of all involved just adds to the confusion. There are also inconsistencies that add to the complexity of this case, and a timeline that, if one detail was proven to be incorrect, could change the whole perception of what occurred. The guilty narrative was also pushed by the media coverage during Margaret's initial trial, tainting the pool of jurors for the second trial held just 8 days later, meaning the headlines were still fresh in people's minds. Overall, there are just 2 options. Margaret was guilty, or there is an individual who committed the murder of a 14-year-old boy who has never been identified. If you want to watch the Rough Justice episode, I have included a link in the description, and I would be interested to know your thoughts on this case. As always, thank you for joining me for It's Murder Up North. The next episode is coming soon. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus terms and conditions apply.
Taxes was waiting around for your taxes to be done, which led to worrying about not getting any money back. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes in a day to get you up to $4,000 fast with a refund advance loan. Now this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Expert filing only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Refund advance has $0 loan fees and 0% APR. Refund advance loans may be issued by First Century Bank, N.A. or WebBank. Terms apply. Subject to approval.